So welcome everyone. My name is Doug Olant. I am the communications manager with the Duchess Land Conservancy, and we want to thank you all for joining us for our 5th webinar in this season of our Earth Matters series. We really enjoy hosting these events. We get a ton out of them ourselves, and we're always happy to have so many guests. Tonight, we are very excited to welcome Alexis Doshas as she gives the presentation, Understanding and Managing Soils for Ecological Health. But first, let's go over some basic logistics about tonight's webinar, followed by a brief introduction to the Duchess Land Conservancy and tonight's presenter. First, you are muted to ensure that there is no interruption during the presentation. Second, the raise hand function is disabled. Please enter all your questions into the Q&A box at any point during the presentation. You can access the Q&A box at the bottom center of your screen. Questions will be addressed when the presentation is done, or by our team during the presentation if possible. If there are a great deal of questions, we will try to combine them based on topics. Third, the chat is disabled for this event. Fourth, closed captioning is enabled for this event. To turn this function on, please select the closed caption icon located on the bottom of your screen. And finally, I will hand it over to Julie Hart, our education director, who will tell you a bit about the Duchess Land Conservancy, this webinar series, and our guest presenter.
Thank you, Doug, and hello, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Julie Hart, an ecologist and educator here at the Duchess Land Conservancy. Many of you are probably familiar with the DLC, but for anyone who is not, let me give you a quick overview. Duchess Land Conservancy is a private nonprofit land conservation organization located in the Hudson Valley of New York State, and we're dedicated to preserving the farms and forests, wetlands and waterways, open spaces and wildlife habitats of Dutchess County. We are an accredited land trust, and since our founding in 1985, we have worked with hundreds of landowners and protected over 46,000 acres of land. Many thanks to the Molly B. Schaefer Education Fund for sponsoring this event. We are so excited about this season of Earth Matters, the DLC's winter webinar series. We're bringing you interesting speakers on the first Tuesday of each month through April, and this season we're digging into the topic of soil health. We're learning about topics such as soil food webs, regenerative soil management practices, composting, and the ecology of soil health. Our theme is very simple. Soil is not dirt. So let's get started. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Alexis Doshas, who teaches classes on propagation and the ecology of native plants and soils, and is the nursery manager at the Native Plant Trust's Nasami Farm, where they grow thousands of native plants from wild ecotype seed to ensure genetic diversity and resiliency in our landscapes. If you're not familiar with the Native Plant Trust, definitely check out their website. It's nativeplanttrust.org. They have lots of great resources and an amazing lineup of classes and field studies. So Alexis's path with plants has included running a small organic gardening business, working as a restoration associate, and leading field research on the long-term effects and mitigation of chronic atmospheric deposition of nitrogen on the heathland communities of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. This very diverse background led Alexis to her role as a conservation horticulturist, plant ecologist, and soil enthusiast. So with that, I will turn it over to Alexis, who will talk about understanding and managing soils for ecological health.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie and Doug. And welcome to everyone here. As Julie said, I am the nursery manager at Native Plant Trust's Nasami Farm. We are located in Whately, Massachusetts in the Connecticut River Valley. And we support the mission. Native Plant Trust is the nation's oldest native plant conservation organization. And we are supporting the mission of preserving and promoting our native flora by producing thousands of native plants. And as Julie was telling about my background, I really got into doing professional gardening out on the Cape Cod, Massachusetts. I really got into kind of the local plants, I would be working with, exotic ornamentals and really having to put a lot of resource and effort into making them thrive in these conditions. There's very unique conditions that are found on the coastal areas. And I started to really be paying attention to the native flora that seemed to be having just a fine time and thriving and doing really well in these conditions. So really started to get me thinking about how plants interact with their environment and with their soils, and how they work together, and maybe thinking about using those plants in our designed landscapes and how to support those plants in our landscapes. And so I got really into soil, as you will when you start learning about native plants and really getting into ecology in general. And so I teach a course, Understanding and Managing Soils, and this will be a brief trip through that class, just to kind of give you an idea. And I will preface this with this is through the lens of Western science. That's the way that I came to learn about soil and the terminology that I'm going to use, but certainly understand that other civilizations, other cultures, all have different ways of looking at classifying soils and understanding them. So they may not use the same language or terminology or even systems, but they're all, observations are valid, and ecological knowledge is valuable from all different aspects and viewpoints. So, and again, I'm also going to be looking through the lens of native plants, because that is my expertise. So we'll get started. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about soil formation, kind of just so we have an understanding of how soil is formed. And then we'll talk a bit about some soil properties that you can look for and understand the different properties that soil takes on to help you identify your soils. And within that, we'll be mixing in our soil life. There's been a lot of presentations about soil life, and it's a very exciting new field of really understanding the soil ecology, the soil biota that feeds and supports our soils and our above ground plants. And then hopefully at the end, I'd like to talk about managing our soils and some things that we can do to help improve and restore some of that balance. And hopefully there'll be a lively discussion. People will have some good questions about or insights that they have experienced. So let's get started. All right, so this is very basic slide, and it's just really emphasizes that the pedosphere is what was called the outermost layer of the earth. That's the soil, and it's really subject to soil formation processes. And I like this slide because it really shows that it's the interface where all of these other spheres are acting upon. So your atmosphere, your hydrosphere, and the lithosphere, all acting upon that outer layer of the earth in creating soil, and including the biosphere, which is also constantly contributing. It's a very dynamic system. It is much quicker turnover and creation and destruction than many of our other spheres that have a longer time frame. So soil formation and development can be described by 5 factors. This was created by Vasily Dukachev, a Russian geologist. He was kind of credited with the foundation for soil science as Western soil science as we look at it. Before his time, soil was kind of looked at as geological, really based on the parent material and kind of geological processes or dead substrate that plants then derived nutritious mineral elements from. And so soil and bedrock were pretty much equated. But he found, he was looking at more of an agricultural, he was tasked with discovering and kind of creating more agricultural and identifying agricultural soils. So he was looking at, he really felt it was more of a natural body, had its own history of development, multiform processes taking place within it. So he came up with this formula: soil equals the function of, if you all remember our algebra, the climate, organism, relief, or what we call topography, and parent material and time. So all of those acting upon themselves, interacting with each other, equals the functioning of soil. Now, more recently, Hans Jenny, a Swiss pedologist, took this and he added the ... for unforeseen factors, which I would infer may be human. We've had a lot to play, roles to play in soil formation as well. So both very fascinating. I'm just going to tease these out a little bit. So for climate, we were really talking about temperature, moisture, and wind. So different levels of temperature and moisture cause leaching and weathering at different rates. And this can be in temperature changes throughout the season, but also daily. So this has a real correlation with moisture and biological activity and rates of chemical reactions. So this is a picture of low S soils in Spain. And you can see that wind is playing a real dominating factor here in the soils, with eroding the hills and shaping the rock formations and redistributing those mineral particles. We also have ice playing a cold ice age, glaciation playing a major factor in soil formation. This is a photo of the Cape where I've done a lot of work, which is really an outwash moraine, which is accumulated unconsolidated glacial debris. So basically when a glacier comes down and covers the earth, and then as it's retreating, it's really pulling back all kinds of different bedrock and material, and just as it melts, it gets left in place. So really, really unconsolidated, very different variety of sizes. This is actually what constitutes the Cape. Glaciers also are responsible for creating valleys and curves and striations on our rocks, so that it can be really a real game changer, as we know. Desertification also, so this is when our when fertile land is transformed into desert, as it becomes progressively drier and unable to support plant growth. And this can this causes a real feedback loop, because the less moisture, less plant material can be there to contribute to soil organic matter, to contribute to more soil. So it just continues a negative feedback loop of being drier and drier and less fertile and less fertile. Conversely, here in the Northeast, for instance, we have a wetter region, and we have a more eudic moisture regime, which means we typically see the same amount of moisture throughout the year. That is changing as climate changes, as we've all probably noticed. And so we will see changes in our native plant communities and our native soils. But traditionally, we have the plant communities we have now, and the soils we have now really respond a response to that moisture. Water is very dynamic and acidic in nature, because it is so dynamic, and the hydrogen particles get plucked out, other compounds out of the soil, and therefore we end up with our very acidic soils, and that we are known to have here in the Northeast. So organisms also play an important role in soil formation. Here are some lichens and mosses and a little bit of ferns here. We call these this branch of microorganisms and animal, they're real primary colonizers. They are the first to come onto the bare soil. They are able, because of their simple biological morphology, they are able to colonize bare rock. And through their processes, they have they don't have rigid cell walls. So as they're processing and they're releasing nutrients, they're pulling them from the rock, they're also releasing polysaccharides and their own biological processes are slowly helping to break down and weather the rock that they are on. So again, a little back and forth, and throughout their biological processes, they're contributing leaf litter. So they have a real key role in building up our early layers of organic matter. And again, as they are broken down by other organisms, they're contributing to that building the soil. Larger critters are also really important in creating soil structure and moving the way that they move through the soil. We call it bioturbation. So whether they are digging, vole patterns through your garden, or digging into the marine floor looking for food, or doing their own biological processes and eating and hunting. They are really creating moving soil particles around, creating pore spaces, and we'll get into all this a little bit later as well. But you may not think of it. You may think, oh, it's one ant or a couple of shrimp. But when you think of the large numbers, they really have a very strong impact on our soil and our soil structures. And then relief is really about topography. And again, kind of a simple slide, but I like that it shows the different climate axis as well. So on the top there, you have what goes on in arid climates and what goes on in more humid climates. And then on the Y, steep slopes to shallow slopes. And really, materials get forced into valleys by gravity, right? So valley soils tend to be deeper and richer, which we know, right? Organic matter and soils on slopes or at higher altitudes tend to be poorer and thinner. And it also affects topography also affects temperature and precipitation. So it usually tends to be cooler up on higher altitudes. And as you see, like in the more humid conditions, we get more of a soil creep where soil is kind of moving slowly down. And then on the more drier conditions, we get more of these like sheet and rill erosions where just a trickle of moisture will really send things going. And there's implications for plant life and soil life. Plants do evolve to survive in these higher altitudes, thinner soils, less nutrients. There is a plant for that, I would say. So up here, these are some alpine vegetation in Vienna, and often the plants will be growing prostrate to the ground. They'll have shallow roots, be able to survive in these really nutrient poor soils, thin soils as we would call them, and they often have sclerophyllous foliage or leaves that are kind of waxy and thick that protect them from desiccation from winds. And this is kind of one of the, let's say if you've ever tried to garden on a hill or a slope, the difficulties of that, because the soil is trying to, the fertile soil and the organic matter is really moving down to the valleys. So terraced gardening, etc. Has been used and employed for millennia. Yeah. This is a photo of the Connecticut River Valley where the farm, Nasami, is located. Just kind of exemplifies the rich, fertile valley soil, also due to the river sediment. And there's our Holyoke Mountain Range in the background. A completely different set of soils. And then there's parent material. So this is the upper layer of rock on which the soil is forming, and under the influence of those biological activities, biochemical processes, and of course human activity. So properties of the parent rock are changed in the process of soil formation, usually through chemical and physical weathering, but also climate, vegetation, but to a large extent, the properties of parent rock still determine properties of the soil. So mineralogical and chemical composition and texture. And they can be really distinguished according to their origin. That's how we usually classify them: sandy and loamy. I'll talk a bit about more about the textures. But the most rocks really is composed of silicons and silicon silicates. And the one important difference between rocks is how much silica they're containing. So less silica rock breaks up more quickly, kind of like a serpentine rock, it kind of flakes off. And if it has more silica, it's much slower to break up. Think like a granite, etc. And if you know kind of some of the characteristics of your parent rock, it can really know how that rock was formed. It can be quite helpful. So, something like a coal is derived from prehistoric plants, right? And limestone and chalks are carbonate rocks that are created from marine creatures, as shown here in this slide here. So you can kind of start to infer how the parent material will respond to physical and chemical weathering by what it was made up of, and also what minerals might be more plentiful in their parent material by knowing what it was formed from. But of all the factors in the soil formation, time is perhaps the most important when it comes to soil formation, because everything takes its very long time indeed. And so as you can see, it takes around 50 to 1,000 years to create just under an inch of topsoil. On the other hand, it can be destroyed in next to no time through erosion, degradation, or cultivation. Showing here, I cleared crop field after a weather event, storm rainfall event. And the soil erosion through cultivation on average in America, on American croplands, loses 1.7 billion tons of soil each year. So we have some work to do to preserve our soils because it takes a really long time to get them back. So really be thinking about that. So you may be asking, well, what is soil then? Is it just our broken down, weathered rock material? Well, it finally becomes soil when organic matter is incorporated within the mineral fragments. So you have your broken down rock materials, again, can be all different kinds. And then we have the soil organic matter, which we call our organic material. And this is what is really going to create a living ecosystem and soil. So before soil organic matter can accumulate, we need those plants. So I again, very basic clip art slide, but I really like this. It shows the succession of a bare parent rock to, in this case, a woodland forest. And you can see in those early stages, it is the primary colonizers who are coming in and able to set up life on those bare rocks. So our cyanotype, our algae, our bacteria, our lichens, our mosses. And as they are exuding polysaccharides and living and dying and creating litter, they're slowly breaking down that rock material and also creating plant litter with their own cells and plant and litter. So as we get more and more of that, it can beget more life, higher life forms. You get herbaceous plants, perhaps, and as they have more extensive roots and more plant litter, when they die back, we're really getting a more complicated system. Deeper soils are being made, and therefore able to support more life, and more soil life will show up in the soils and be able to survive and populate there, et cetera, until we get to our final woodland forest. And then some natural disaster comes along or human disaster comes along and can reset some of that process, reset the process. But soil organic matter is mostly vegetal. It's about 58% carbon. It consists of decomposing plants and animal residues at various stages. So you're getting cells and tissues of soil organisms as well, all of our microorganisms that tend to have pretty quick life cycles. You get all of that. You get substances synthesized by soil organisms. And so soil organic matter really exerts some positive effects on our soil's physical and chemical properties, as well as the soil's ability to regulate ecosystem services. Particularly, the presence of soil organic matter is regarded as being critical for soil function and soil quality, right? The more we have. What is happening is as I said, all of that debris, animal residues, animal plant residues is being broken down, is reduced to simple chemical forms. And that is happening through mineralization by our soil biota. So fungi, bacteria, etc., are able to be breaking down that residues and those compounds into more simple forms that can then be used by our plants or be stored away. Which is also a very good thing, which we do want. But we'll talk about that because soil structure needs to be in place for things to be stored away. So the main compounds of plants that are contributing to our soil organic matter are cellulose from plant walls, proteins and amino acids, fats and waxes, lignin, etc. And so these supply nutrients to the plant. They also contribute to the physical nature by binding soil particles into discrete units or aggregates, as we call them. And we're really learning that aggregates are extremely important in soil structure. But I've been talking a lot about the mineral and the organic material, which makes up about 50% of soil. But equally important is pore space. On average, 50% is pore space. Obviously, if you have a very compacted soil, that's going to be different depending on the bulk density. But equally important for air and water exchange is our pore space. We need to have that space for nutrient and gas exchange, for water exchange, and as habitat for our soil life. They need to be able to move around. They need to have a little watery film, and they need to have space. So this is a cross section of a highly structured and active short grass prairie, which I think is a beautiful illustration of what an aggregate looks like. So aggregates are both on the micro and the macro scale. So your aggregate can be a couple of different flakes of mineral fragments, as well as 10,000 flakes, and larger clumps being held together by fungi, plant roots, by sugars and polymers and glues that are being secreted by plants or from decomposing materials. So these are what are creating our aggregates, and it takes time for these to be formed. It takes intact systems for these to be formed, and soil aggregates are really important for storing nutrients, because I'm highlighting some of the critters that are in here. So yes, we've created habitat for our soil life. They can also hide from other predatory critters, nematodes going after cysts, for instance. So it's creating a habitat for them to live in, and it's also storing away nutrients so that they cannot access them, because our soil life, our bacteria, our fungi, they want to, they're looking for these compounds and nutrients. But if some of the pools get stored away in these tightly held aggregates, so tightly held that the critters cannot get into them, soil life cannot get in there to mineralize them, and therefore they get stored away. So this is when we're talking about storing carbon. This is what we need. So we really need to have healthy, intact aggregates, and a variety of aggregates, right, of all different sizes. And so in order to do proper, to restore a proper balance and, so, and storing of nutrients. So we'll talk a little bit about, but what happens, how do we break up, how do we break up aggregates, and maybe some of our practices that we do that cause the destruction of that. We'll get back to that. So soil, of course, is not all created equally or in one monolithic mass. It is developed over time in layers, and we call this horizonation. This is a temperate soil profile, so kind of something you would see here, again in the Northeast. And scientists have given, they use capital letters to describe the different horizons of soil as it's being formed. So here we have the O horizon, which is that loosely organic matter, full of leaf litter and partially decomposed material. And then you get into your inorganic matter mixed with humus. And especially here in the temperate region, we have this E horizon, which, because it is eluviation, so it's movement of insoluble particles down the profile. And this happens a lot because of our acidic soils. So again, that hydrogen is grabbing minerals and pulling it through the soil. And there'll be different, if you ever done a soil core, or if you ever see a big ditch, you can really see some of these soil profiles. So it's telling you a bit about the chemical processes that are going on in your soils, and also kind of what your parent materials were, or are rather, and it will be different parts of the world, different conditions. And of course, as scientists, we want to classify things, and so there is a taxonomy of soil taxonomy, the highest level being soil orders, of which there are 12 throughout the world, and the lowest being the soil series, often a place name. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background, but again, we are not the only culture or lens to look through. I came across these Abenaki soil names. The Abenaki people are here where I live in southern Vermont, and mostly Vermont, and they were here when the European settlers arrived, and they are still here, and they use their own classification system. They have language. They've understood soil and been working with it for hundreds of years, and have their own classification system. This is just some of their terminology that I wanted to share. Now, this is the global map of our soil orders, and I like to show it because it really shows how the climate kind of distributes and affects our soils, right? We have gellosols up here in the Arctic, andisols, kind of more in the volcanic range, and then we have our tropical soils, or oxasols here in the tropical regions. I'll just show you a little bit of the US, and I think it can really inform us, like what kind of what plants grow where, and really speak to the different natural communities we have if we understand our soil, our parent soils, and our classes. So here again, showing that andesol soils in the pink over here along the Pacific coast, where we have volcanic ranges, and then right here through the Midwest country where we're growing a lot of agricultural crops. There's really rich greens and molsols, which is deep base and rich humus humus soils. And then over here in New England and in the Northeast, I wanted to show we have a lot of these kind of classified as younger soils, and they're still forming, and there's going to be, and again, those spodosols, which are more acidic. One of the reasons that we have some of this new younger soils is because of that those glaciers scraped a lot of our soils off. And so what we're in a process of kind of building our soils in the long view. So we tend to have low, kind of not as defined soil profiles, and especially out on the Cape and some of the coastal areas where they're constantly being acted upon and reset by the climate. So like as I said, the lowest classification is the soil series, often named after a place. There's 23,000 series in the US, and often they, with different slopes and surface textures. And the USDA soil survey, there's a web soil survey, and here's a link up here that you can go to. And it's really interactive and fun, and you can make your own reports on an area that you're interested in by typing in an address or a geographical region, and you create a polygon, and it will tell you which soil series, give you the parent material, give you the hydrology. There's a lot of a data explorer tab that you can look into. I really encourage you to check that out. And it gives you a lot of that baseline information about what kind of soils you have. Of course, we've been acting upon these soils as humans for a long time, but at least that can give you some information. A lot of the soil order names are taken from indigenous languages, so having to do with those places. So, and again, in our neck of the woods, we have Allagash soils, Missisquoi, Monadnock, Occam, Scantic, Sunapee, and they're all words that are describing that place and describing those soils. So definitely play around with that. I'm just going to talk a little bit about soil properties, kind of give you some ideas of what to look for when you're looking at your soils. So texture is really referring to the feel of the soil. And so our mineral fragments, our parent materials, are broken down into mineral fragments, which we classify into 3 different particle sizes. So you have sand, silt, and clay. And as texture refers to the combination of these 3 that you have in your soil. And this gives you the feel of the soil. It's, if you have a coarse sand, you probably have a higher percentage of sand to silt or clay. And it feels gritty and doesn't hold together well. You can have a wet clay, which feels heavy and sticky. And that's going to have a real interaction with your environmental conditions. So with sandy soils, if you have drought or heavy rains, it's going to be freely draining. And if you have more clayey soils, that's going to become a bit waterlogged. And so this is a nice comparison of the different particle sizes. So here's a grain of sand versus a grain of silt and a speck of clay down here. And so they're classified by the size of the particle, but clay is also a secondary mineral, which I'll talk about in a minute. It is actually electrically charged. So here is sand. It's made up of weathered primary rock minerals. They're irregular in outline. They're large. They don't pack together well, right? If you've ever tried to make a snowball out of sand, large pore spaces in between, lots of large pore spaces. So that is good. So air and water flow through it rapidly, but so it provides that water movement and gas exchange, which is vital. But if you're having too much of that, right, we're going to see nutrient loss, and none of that water or nutrients get caught in these particles. So they're moving too rapidly through. Then you have silt, which is smaller than sand. So it's a little more smaller pore spaces, as you can see, a little more smooth edges, often found right in waterways and riverbeds. It's more difficult to drain, but it is not chemically altered or charged as clay is. So here's clay, and it is tiny but mighty. You can see from this slide, clay particles are considered secondary minerals, meaning they've been altered by weathering. They are no longer just smaller versions of primary materials. And this often, or this has also created a chemical charge. So these interlocking sheets of clay, flocculate is the term, where they pile up on each other and they're attracted to each other, and they create these really strong bonds. And what this is doing is causing the trapment of water and nutrients in between these interlocking sheets, which is great for nutrient and water retention. But as you can imagine, just like in the sand, it's kind of a little too much in the opposite direction, where you're not getting enough pore space. If you have too much of this going on, if you're too much clay, you're not getting that exchange of air and water. And if water is being held too tightly, it's actually can be suffocating to your plants, because the plants can't access that water, even though it's there. If it's being held so tightly in between these sheets of clay. So, and critters and soil life, again, needs to have room to move around, and they also need oxygen. There are, as we'll talk about, some soil life that are anaerobic and can survive in anaerobic conditions. They just tend to be less productive and less in numbers if we're looking for biodiversity, which we do want biodiversity in our soil life as well as in our above ground life. So this is soil texture. There are many tests out there you can do, some really simple ones like a ribbon test. There's also a mason jar test, where you can take your soil and shake it up and kind of be measuring it as the different particles settle out. I would encourage you to look those up, and then you can map them, those measurements, on a soil texture chart. That kind of gives you an idea of what you have for soil texture. And this is going to be really helpful for depending on your need, helping you identify what kind of soil you've got, and what kind of amendments you could use if it's a garden, or you wanted to have a certain plant or certain and you're realizing, oh, maybe I should figure out if my soil will support that. A lot of agricultural soils really are geared towards the loam. Tends to be kind of a sweet spot for agricultural crops. And that's usually about equal parts silt and sand, about 10 to 20% clay. So once we can start adding clay, you can see it really dominates the properties of the soil. So depending, again, what your management is and your view and who the stakeholder is, it really, it'll really just give you a better idea. And if you're a mnemonic person, we have the songs of soil texture, which can kind of help you kind of remember where things are. The red dirt girl up here in the clays, and the dust in the wind over here in the silt, and the one grain of sand over here. Heaven is a place on earth, right? Is that loamy spot. So that can kind of help you out there. Yeah, and so soil structure, I'll just talk, this is kind of about how all those aggregates are working together. They can be blocky or granulated or massive, say, clay particles. And what we're really looking here is it's really the formation and destruction of organic matter. Our soil structure controls our porosity, the movement of water, and how these how our structure can be destroyed or deteriorated. You can think of compaction, cultivation, removal of vegetation, excessive moving and handling, screening, etc. So just be thinking about that. Soil moisture, again, just is that measurement of pore space in the soil, affecting the hydrological cycling of nutrients, our microbial transportation, as we talked about, and of course, it's a basic need of plant life. So knowing porosity is the measure of rock that's open space, and permeability is the ease with which that moves through. And then soil color can really tell us a lot about our soils. It's really it's the indication of the chemical reactions that have been happening in our soils, and it really adds beauty to our landscapes. And there's a real range of it, and it can tell you a lot about your soils. I'll just briefly run through these. So our vitisols, right, kind of drier soils, and they tend to have that kind of tan whiteness sheen where the evaporation exceeds precipitation, and our salts and carbonate minerals are pulled to the soil surface. You've got oxisols, which are our tropical soils, which there's so much soil action here, and there's so much leaf litter, or not leaf litter, plant material, but is being, because it's so warm, our soil life is really, really super active, and basically eats that all up and mineralizes it. So there is not a lot of organic material in our soils down here. And we're seeing a lot of the rusty colored related to the presence of aluminum and iron oxide from that excessive chemical weathering. And then vertisols, we tend to see more of these gray greens. If you're seeing that, that's an example of anaerobic processing from anaerobic bacteria that can survive in these really wet soils. And so if you're seeing kind of blues and grays, you can pretty much be sure you're working in a wetland or a wet soil. And here's an example of our mollisols, which are kind of that beautiful prairie grasslands that have so much herbaceous material and roots both above ground and below ground. They're constantly contributing this soil organic material, the deep humus layers. Mollisols. And then here we are in the Northeast with our spodosols, as I mentioned, that kind of gray layer, where a lot of our minerals are being leached out. You can see we tend to, because we have a cooler climate, we tend to have this organic layer where things are not being processed as quickly. Very traditional spodosol there. And then the gelosol is very much like the vertisols, but even the slower pace, slower processing happening because of the cool. So you tend to get a lot of buildup of organic matters. Think of the peat bogs, etc. It's just a lot of our soil life needs to have warmer temperatures to be really active as well. And then of course, pH, I won't spend too much time on it because I'm sure a lot of gardeners are familiar with it, but I do like this graph because it really visualizes for me why, what we're talking about when we're talking about having that, sweet between 6 to 8.5, etc., 5 to 8 pH, why it's so important, because all of these nutrients are available at that pH. And many of our plants, especially our vegetable crops, require these minerals for their growth. And the reason that they're available is because our soil life is active at this pH, and they're able to process and mineralize these nutrients and make them available for our plants. That being said, I will point out that there are plants that have evolved to survive in the lower, the more acidic soils with iron, manganese, boron. So understanding what you have and working with plants in that palette can really aid in your designs, etc., plant communities. So now I'm just going to talk a bit about our soil life and soil food web, and then how those interact with our plant and soil. I'm trying to wrap this up a little bit so we can talk about management. I think a lot of the other offerings this soil series have talked a lot about our soil food web, but this is a kind of a cross section of a soil food web. And you can really see that it's on the plant roots. It can be as small and tiny as a bacteria, or as large as a mole, right? And they're all contributing. We want them all there, being productive and present. And the more life, the more activity we have, the more diverse and resilient our plants are going to be. So they're really plant producing nutrient-rich soil supports plant production. And so plant production is required by us and other animals as a food source. Therefore, if healthy plants can be produced due to lack of or inactive soil organisms, our higher trophic levels suffer. We do, right? And so when we use practices that discourage or kill our soil food web, we're really harming ourselves in the end, because our plants won't be as healthy and will need more resources and be kind of straggling along. And so if we can reinstate or support these healthy ecosystems, then the plants, it's kind of like we can get out of the way and everybody can can be providing healthy plants for us to be consuming. So that's my spiel on that. But some of the critters that you'll see in the soil, some of the larger ones here, we've got the major groups are bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, collembolans or springtails here, mites and earthworms. And they're all, they're all really living their own lives and eating and dying and mineralizing nutrients for what they need to do. And this is what is being used by our plants and symbiotically in many instances. So bacteria and fungi alone make up about 95% of organismal biomass, and altogether their value is estimated at 1.5 trillion a year worldwide by that was the USDA for their soil services, right? You don't have to put in all those fertilizers if the soil life is making them available for our plants. So I'm just going to run through these. So there's bacteria, they can inoculate soil, and they're really good at providing nitrogen among other nutrients, and taking it from a form that the plants can't use and turning it into a form that the plants can use by just their own actions. And if you saw Jeff Lowenfeld's presentation, just, again, this is kind of some new and exciting that we thought bacteria is mostly in and around the roots, but now we're actually finding it up in the plants and the plant cells itself, helping those plants fix nitrogen right within the cells. So it's really a fascinating new time. Fungi, as we know, helps transport minerals from plant roots from plant to plant, long distances. It's about 99% of plants have an associated relationship with fungi. It can either be endomycorrhizae, where they go into the cell walls, or ectomycorrhizae, where they sheath over the plant roots, and they really they're really important for the whole system-wide health, sharing resources, and they're very easily disturbed by tilling practices and breaking soil up. So just be thinking about that with our own practices. A great resource is Fantastic Fungi, or Paul Stamets. He writes a lot about fungi, and that film actually shows some very nice visuals of how it all works. And of course, the fruiting body, as we know. And I also want to say fungal hyphae is very important for holding soil particles together, right? So not only is it having a biological contributions, but it's really structurally as well very important for holding all of these small, tiny particles together. Fungal hyphae. Protozoas, nematodes, tardigrades, which is fascinating. These are all predators. Well, not all predators. Some tardigrade will also eat algae and plants, but a lot of the nematodes, protozoa, mites, they are helping keep basically the populations of our bacteria and our fungi down, right? We want to have balance. So that's what all these critters kind of come and do and move through the soil and kind of are attracted to those booming populations, and they kind of keep things in check. And again, through their mineralization of eating bacteria, are releasing other forms of nutrients into the soil. So also contributing. Mites are very important for helping us shred all plant litter and debris. And again, just bringing that back in the bioturbators. Again, kind of creating a soil structure, moving soil around. We have ants and earthworms, consider the conveyor belt to systemically return soil from the top to the bottom. Mixed masters, which are burrowing and tunneling, and crate makers like the larger aardvarks and badgers who really kind of break up soil particles in search of food. And so they're all kind of creating different micro topographies in our soils and contributing to it that way. And I was going to highlight the earthworm for that reason. Friend of the garden, foe of the forester. And it was actually Darwin who first kind of studied the earthworm in greater detail in modern times by placing a bunch of chalk on a portion of his land, and then years later getting back to the study and finding the chalk had been moved about 18 centimeters down the soil profile. So really seeing that they do have quite an effect on kind of cycling material through the soil, and again, lubricating tunnels, etc. But the harm in them is that they're so good at what they do, and they really work through plant litter and decompositioning our plant debris that our native communities here in the Northeast didn't have earthworms and evolved without earthworms. So they tend to have a really slow decomposition rates, really slow nutrient turnover. And so as the earthworms move into the forest, they are kind of speeding up that process, which will have an effect on our plant communities and our soil life and nutrient cycling. And you may see different plants take advantage of these different nutrients, and we may lose some communities that we have that want to have kind of that more acidic, slower rate. So therein lies the quandary over the earthworm. Yes, I think I kind of covered this. I'm going to try to run ahead to our management. But plant soil interactions, the roots are, sending out oleochemicals and hormones to recruit soil life to come and say, hey, come here, I've got this great stuff, and I'll give you this, and you'll give me my nitrogen in the form that I would want to have it. And then our predatory critters, our nematodes and protozoas, can also read those signals and know that that's where their food source is going to be. And so the rhizosphere, this area, can be very active, full of soil biodiversity. So it's important to have roots in the ground, and it's important to leave roots in the ground, which we'll talk about in a few minutes too. Again, being habitat for our critters. I was going to go through the nitrogen cycle, but I think just basically understanding that atmospheric nitrogen is in a form that most life cannot access. And so as it drops to the ground, our critters and our nitrogen fixing bacteria can take that and move it into a form that everybody else can use. So basically complex, right? But it's just like all of our other ecologies, right? Ecology, soil ecology, woodland ecology. There are layers and layers of connections, and restoring as much diversity underground will beget diversity above ground. And so the more soil life we can have happening, the healthier the plants, the more diverse the type of plants we can have, health, and then the healthier we will be, and other trophic levels that rely on those. I'm going to quickly talk about a few different things that we can do for managing our soils, and then hopefully we'll have some time to talk. I will stop talking. Just to point out the obvious, I frame the class to kind of explain, kind of how soil's formed and how it should be functioning. And then so that when we go to think about managing it, we can have all that in place. So this is a managed soil, right? A highly managed soil. And I hopefully we're all looking at this and going, yuck, right? Like this is not full of life. So when a soil's tilled, the aggregates are broken up, which releases nutrients that have been stored in those larger aggregates. And so these freed nutrients are now available for mineralization by plants and soil organisms. So this generally produces a boost to net primary productivity. So that, that first year gardener, that first, field that gets plowed tends to yield a high plant production. But through that mineralization, the microbes burn through the available nutrients, and then you have a depleted nutrient pool. It's all been used up. We also then, conventional practices remove all the plant debris because we're worried about disease from the soil surface. So we're essentially depriving the soil of those nutrient inputs from decomposing soil organic matter, right? We take all the plant material off, then there's nothing to replenish those nutrient pools or to feed our soil life. So, I'm sure you've been reading and learning about adaptive management practices, kind of letting native vegetation, leaving some aggregates to form, or using minimal plowing and tilling practices. Those are some things we can do, but most of our soils have been disturbed and our natural systems compromised, including the water cycle, nutrient mineralization, and the whole soil biotic ecosystem. And as I said, if the soil system is not operating properly, then plants can't reach maximum health. And if they're not healthy, they will look diminished, they'll grow slower, they'll produce less bloom, be less robust, and even lack shine and fragrance. So we really need to address the soil to get that, to get those gardens and those plants that we really want to be as healthy as possible, and therefore contributing to a healthy functioning ecosystem. Even here in the Northeast, where we have a lot of our lands going back to forest, there is a history of land use, and that the soils are still recovering. And I always highlight the merino wool craze of the 1800s, where we cleared lots and lots of land for our wool. So what are some things you can do? Cover cropping, so soil, keeping something on the soil, so protecting it from erosion. Even if this can be done large scale, it can be done small scale. I would use a diverse collection of annuals. Most likely would be easier to deal with than perennials. Cover crops, native if you can find them, or a mixture of them. Clovers are always really nice because they are nitrogen fixing, but look at the root system, right? And so even if this isn't your end goal, you are starting to build that soil and creating habitat for soil life, encouraging them to be there. Creating that soil structure. And if it's an annual, then they can die back and then be contributing to leaving those roots in the ground. So don't be pulling roots out. Site evaluation, really, again, know what you've got for soil, know what you've got for water, wind, sun exposure. This is the right plant, right place idea. And we have a plant finder app on our nativeplanttrust.org, and you can pick kind of what you're looking for: a ground cover, a grass, etc. You can pick color or bloom time, whatever your needs are, and then include some of this, aspects and types of soil, and it will generate a list of native plants that would fit those conditions, and that will contribute. That will really help the soil. It'll address the soil that you have there, kind of work in concert with it, and it will require a lot less from you as a manager or a gardener, by a lot less bringing in inputs and fertilizers, etc., extra work and more extractive resources. Compaction is something to address. This is really where carbon stabilization happens. So kind of trying to get more pore space into your soils. Some of it can be as simple as like alternating the way you mow your lawns, aerating your soils with a broad fork, or there's actually machinery that can aerate your soils. Reconsider how you manage your gardens. You can compost in place is one idea. I like to cut a lot of my annuals at the base and leave their root systems, so that again, this is all if the plants are healthy. If you have a diseased plant, then you should remove it. But if the plants are healthy, leaving them there, letting them compost in the rows in between or on the edges of your properties. That's the chop and drop method is called. And therefore you're not disturbing that soil structure or that soil life that is living among the roots. And getting to know your weeds, because a weed is just a plant that you in a place you don't want, but it can also be, if it wants to grow there, it's telling you your situation. So as we know, the dandelion, oh, that's right. This slide is the back slide here is a dandelion root, as I'm sure we all know what that looks like. And that's really telling you they have compacted soils, because that plant can work in compacted soils, and it really helps to break them up. So really getting to know what you have for your weeds will tell you, okay, I have a really compacted soil, or I have a really poor soil, like docks, for instance, are also a sign of compaction. And that can kind of then go, okay, that's what I've got here. I should be thinking about this suite of plants, or if I want to do some amendments, I should be thinking about ways to amend my compaction, for instance. Mulch, keeping the ground covered is essential. I would say, biologically speaking, wood mulch is the least beneficial. Chopped straw, shredded leaves are probably the best. I'll go on to my quick rant about leaves. We should be using them. We should not be putting them in bags and sending them away. You can use them as mulch. You can dig them into your garden as fertilizer. You can leave them in a pile to decompose, to use as leaf mold, and or compost. It's the answer. It's the closed loop circle, right? We're getting all of our fertilizer. And what's great about leaves is they can act, if you have a really dry soil, worked into a dry soils, they really help with water retention. And if you have a really compacted soil, they really help by creating more fluff and more airspace. So they're really kind of very versatile. And that'll be my spiel on the leaves. So leave the leaves, as they say, right? And design, really be thinking about if you are working in garden design, really be thinking about curves, different layers, different, different levels of your of shrubs and trees and ground covers, and herbaceous layers, because that will beget all different kinds of soil life. We'll be looking for different, because they'll be exuding different compounds, and so you get more diversity in your soil life as well as just looking beautiful. So I will end there. So we have a few minutes for questions. I'm sorry, I tried to cram that all in there. Here's some references for you. A great book is Dirt, the Ecstatic Skin of the Earth. There it is, by William Bryant Logan. If you want to kind of read some great essays, waxing poetic about dirt and earth and all that. It's really fun. And then there's a quote from his book: one motive for protecting the soil is the certainty that it is fragile, does not have the same unchanging character as a mountain or river. It is recent and ephemeral product. We owe it our lives, and our energy and the bodies we give it are not payment enough. So I will take any questions or any insights you've all had working with soils you want to share. And thank you.
Thank you, Alexis. That was wonderful. I learned so much. I love the soil song triangle. That's a great way to look at it. So, so I just want to remind everyone that you will be receiving a follow-up email from us. Everyone who registered will get the email that will contain a link to the recording of tonight's presentation, as well as a list of some resources. So I've been jotting down some of the websites that Alexis was mentioning along the way. And so some of those websites will be included in there as follow-up, so you can look into this more deeply. And I also want to mention that our next webinar, which is the last one of the season, we wrap up in April. So on April 4th, we will be having Rick Carr, who is the farm director with the Rodale Institute. His presentation is called Composting and Vermicomposting, Separating the Feel Good from the Real Good. So I'm really excited to hear that one. It sounds like we're going to be talking about worms a little more. I'm really excited about that. So it looks like we've got some questions in the chat. And are you ready for some questions, Alexis?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So first up, are there quick growing cover crops that we could grow now that we could turn back into the soil in May?
You have exposed soil now. Yeah, I mean, I would say any of those legumes, maybe early crops, I would put some on. I think another native one is partridge pea. That can be a nice one. Yeah, anything that's really early. If anyone else has any other ideas, I would do an annual, something that can be turned over quickly. And something probably in the legume family that can give you some nitrogen fixation this early.
Yeah. Okay, great. Our next question is, other than Native Plant Trust, is there any other website you recommend for lists of native plants versus non-native?
Yes, Wild Seed Project is really great. They're up in Maine. They have a lot of very educational tools about how to get started with native plants, and certainly like helping you match the native plant for your situation. So I would definitely recommend Wild Seed Project. There's also, trying to think of who else out there. Blue Stem Natives is a local nursery that's doing good work in the Eastern Mass area. I'm trying to think of like it's native versus non-native. Prairie Moon is a bit more Midwest, but they also have kind of some literature on some of that as well.
Okay, great. That's a lot of good alternatives. And I was scribbling those down as you were saying, so I can include those in the follow-up email as well.
Yeah.
Now, the next question is about adding ectomycorrhizae. Is Magic Plant, is that a brand name? I'm not sure what that is. Magic Plant or something similar?
Yeah, you can add mycorrhizae. I know a lot of soils are, like a lot of potting materials are now coming with mycorrhizae added into them, which I think is very helpful if you're a nursery or somebody starting from seed, because you're kind of getting, you can inoculate your seeds as well with mycorrhizae and other beneficial bacteria. Just kind of get that relationship started before you even get it in the ground. You can add it into your soils for sure. A great way is just by doing compost and putting a compost onto your leaves or half composted leaves or a good well aged compost or kind of soil amendment, because that will have it in there. And then, mycorrhizae tend to like woody material. So kind of having some finer wood chips going in a compost pile, you can end up with fungi, kind of a fungi compost pile, just wood chips that can be really helpful.
Great, thank you, Alexis.
Yeah.
Our next question, you mentioned clover as a cover of crop and also annual. Is there clover that is an annual?
Yes, I think that the red clovers, I think a lot of clovers are annual. It's just if you let them go to seed, you might run into trouble. So it's a matter of catching them in the right time.
Okay, that's good to know. So we have more of a comment than a question. This is someone who's just saying, thank you for the chart on the alkaline and acidic soil. That was very clarifying in terms of what nutrients are available. And the next question is about biochar. Is there good biochar and bad biochar? So this person has just read an article about biochar being made from sewage biosolids that could include PFAS that may not be removed during the burning process that's used to create that.
Yeah. I am not an expert on that, but it sounds like there could be if it isn't processed properly. That's a real danger. People were asking me recently about getting good compost and how can you guarantee that there's no residual pesticides in your compost, and it's really hard unless you're doing it yourself to be sure about that. And yes, you can get them hot enough, but it's really hard to say. So I would go with a reputable source and maybe do some more reading up on that, on the burning process, and see does PFAS burn off? What is its shelf life and longevity? That is tricky.
Thanks, Alexis.
Yeah.
So our next question is about jumping worms.
Yeah.
So this person wants to know what about jumping worms and how they operate on soil.
Yeah, they're kind of like our earthworms, but but even more bigger. So they're having the same effect. And I think the problem with the jumping worms is that they don't have a natural biocontrol here in our landscapes. So they are just really, really productive with processing soil. So again, the trouble there is that our native plant communities haven't evolved with that, and are going to respond differently to having that much nutrient turnover in their soils.
Yeah, and they're fairly new to the landscape, so we're still kind of figuring out what the effects are going to be. But I've been seeing them in a lot of places. They do seem to be spreading very, very quickly.
Yes. And I think, I mean, there's a lot of studies being done on them, of like how to control them, what they will be doing. And again, it's kind of got to do with they haven't been here before, and so how are they changing the soil chemistry, and what does that mean for the other soil life that's in the soil, and the plants that have gotten used to kind of the way things were. A lot of times with like invasive plants or invasive, they'll change the soil chemistry, and therefore it makes it more just through their own, exudates, etc. And therefore it's no longer hospitable for your native plant or other kinds of plants. And so it's kind of just begets more of their kind. So
yeah, it's a lot of changes very suddenly.
Yeah.
All right, so the next question is, do native plantings have similar watering needs to most landscape plants before they are established?
That's a good question. Usually, depending on the size of the plant, I would always recommend watering them for the first season that while they're getting established. Yeah. They probably won't need it as much, I would say, as ornamental. If you're putting a plant in a site where it wouldn't normally be found, they tend to require it, but they will also require it continuously throughout their life than once a native plant is established. it can pretty much, if it's in the right place, it'll require a lot less of your inputs.
Okay, and the next question is about legumes. Oh, I love legume questions. Which legume gives you the best bang for your buck in terms of nitrogen fixation?
Oh, good. There's a whole bunch out now that are like, are we talking about the plants or the, I guess we're talking about the plants. Gosh. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I tend to go towards those clovers. I really think that they're good. I haven't done a whole bunch of research with other ones. I know the partridge pea, like I said, we really kind of encourage that because it's a native plant anyway. So it will do well. And then you're not worried about having introduced, anything else if it were to go to seed. So I would say I like the partridge pea. It's gonna be beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you, Alexis. So our next question is about tilling. Is it true that using a mechanical soil tiller destroys the topsoil structure and creatures?
Yes. Short answer, yes. So it depends on your tiller. Obviously, they make some that are disc tillers that kind of don't do as much damage pulverizing to the soil, but it is going to break up the structure and it is going to damage some soil life. I mean, some of the soil life is so tiny that it's going to be okay. But it tends to break up the aggregates, as I was explaining. And so a lot of nutrients are released, and so you'll have a really good boom year, and then you've kind of depleted the soil a little bit. So I remember when I first started studying soil science, I was like, what? Because it was always like, you want every soil particle to be the same size and nice and neat, no weeds, and it really turned, my thinking on its head to be thinking about this. But yes, if you don't need to till the soil, don't. There's lots of other ways of smothering weeds. A lot of times it just takes a little planning and thinking about it. But I would certainly suggest doing something else besides tilling. If your goal is to create healthy soil, support soil ecosystems.
Thank you. So the next question is about leaf mulch. When I add leaf mulch to the garden, should I leave it on top or till it in?
Again, you can leave it on top and it will decompose. You can push it aside when you want to sow or plant into it. You could also dig it in the fall. You could dig it into the first 6 inches of your soil, just with, with depending on if it's a garden beds or if it's a larger, and let it just kind of work its way into the soil. Don't need to till it in, unless you're on a shorter time frame and you really want to get it incorporated. But
so basically, the less disturbance, the better, right?
Exactly. Again, it's all your perspective and what you want, your aesthetic. I always, it's and even if you're just doing some of it and leaving some areas of your yard, leaving the leaves in some areas and cleaning up other areas, that's better than removing all the leaves. So just do kind of the best that you can do with your clients or in your own landscapes.
Thanks, Alexis. As a big advocate of mulching leaves on your lawns and just leaving them there.
Yes, exactly.
I appreciate the answer. Our next question. I imagine slugs are good for the soil, but they are bad for my plants. What do you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, slugs, they're kind of like, it's the same kind of thing about having too much of one thing. It's like you want to have that balance. So slugs, you can do the beer trick. I've definitely drowned a lot of slugs doing that. Putting a little beer in a shallow cup on the soil surface. They tend to really go for that. And then I just pick them off. I've used diatomaceous earth to discourage them. This is about particular garden plants. You want to protect those garden plants. landscape size, it's a little trickier to deal with. What likes to eat slugs? Birds, right? Encourage some birds to come in. So
Yeah.
think of what likes them and then encourage that. Encourage their natural
figure out
predators.
who their predators are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, I've drowned many a slug in a dish of
Right.
beer myself.
Yeah.
So back to the leaves. Now this is a question, what about mulching leaves? So I think this is asking in terms of when you're adding leaves, when you're adding leaves as mulch, do you leave them entire or do you chop them? I think is what they're asking.
Yeah. Again, that's kind of your personal choice. I mean, there are different, you can mulch, it will help them break down quicker, but as we know, a lot of our moths and invertebrates overwinter in leaves. So, you may be harming some of those populations if you mulch all of your leaves. You could mulch some of your leaves and not all of them, but if you're talking about like mulching with a lawnmower, yeah, it just helps them break down quicker. But if you make a leaf pile, if you have the room to do it, and you just let your leaves pile there for 3 to 6 months, they will turn into very nice leaf mold, which is composted leaves. But you can also just mulch with whole leaves. Obviously, the larger the leaf, I know some people have said, it can form a mat. So I would go out there and fluff it up if you have like really large leaves. You can kind of like rake them up in the spring and kind of help it break up a little bit. And again, it's your aesthetic. If you want to have a little neater, you can mulch your leaves and it will look, I think that last slide I had from the garden, this shows leaf mulch. This is from the garden in the woods, and they just use leaf mulch as a mulch. So,
and how much difference is there in terms of tree species? Because I know I've seen, maple leaves tend to break down pretty quickly, whereas oak leaves will stick around for a year or two.
Right,
So.
and that's what I remember somebody telling me they had a lot of oaks, and oaks have tannins, which can be hard to break down and also change. Be leaching that in. So yeah, it depends on what you have. If you've got a lot of pine, for instance, you might want to, you're going to have really acidic soils. So maybe think of plant pallets that are your ericaceous, your blueberries, bearberries, things that are going to really thrive in those conditions. If you have a lot of that leaf litter.
Well, we have one final suggestion here regarding the slugs. So this person suggests to put slugs in your compost pile and let them work on making compost.
Excellent.
I love that. Put them to
great.
work. Let them do their sluggy thing.
That's really, I think the takeaway here is like, if you can encourage and support like these, we're trying to get to less work for ourselves, right? And so the more you can support these systems and have this biodiversity, the work will be done for us and our gardens will be healthier for it. So it will require less input from us.
Yeah.
So,
good advice. Let the system work.
Yeah.
And let all the parts do their jobs. And here's another suggestion. I also feed slugs to frogs.
There you go. I'm gonna get some more frogs. Get some more frogs into the garden.
Yes, complete the food web.
Exactly.
Let those nutrients cycle.
Yeah. Excellent. Great. Ooh. Yeah.
All right. So that answers all the questions. If anyone has any other questions, please go ahead and type them in. It looks like we are wrapping up though. And so I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you, Alexis, for a very wonderful presentation. And thanks for a lot of great advice in the Q&A. Just remind everyone you'll get a follow-up email that has a link to the webinar recording and a lot of the links and websites that Alexis has mentioned, so you can dig a little deeper into this topic.
Thank you.
So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Alexis, and everyone have a great night.
Thank you, everyone.